Good morrow, friends. This is Jordan, and you're listening to Not Strictly History.
Hi, everybody, and happy October. It is a very, very good day here on Not Strictly History because I am thrilled to be here. I didn't say excited. I'm switching it up, okay? I had this planned, forethought, okay? I am really excited for October. I hope that you guys enjoyed our very first spooky episode last week. It was a lot of fun, and I do have a very special Halloween episode planned for all of you guys, so stay tuned for that. Now, we have some housekeeping to attend to, and by that I mean I'm going to ramble at you for a second. You can feel free to skip ahead if you're into that sort of thing. So, I usually begin every episode kind of by telling you why we're here, how we got here, etc. Last week I mentioned that there is an episode on the back burner kind of that I've been working on, and I really wanted to be able to do it justice, and so it's not happening yet. And I said it might be coming out this week. That's actually a lie, and it might not come out next week either, but it is coming. I promise it's coming. It'll be the next episode that we do. Um, I I actually now I'm really nervous because I feel like I've hyped it up a lot, and then it'll come out, and you guys will be like, okay, like that was an episode. But I'll explain more when it comes out, and it'll all make sense. So today's episode is well, today's episode is actually kind of part of something really interesting that's been happening to me this whole season on Not Strictly History. Before season 2 ever began, I had the entire season planned out. I had every episode written down, before I ever started. If you follow me on Instagram, Not Strictly History _podcast, you might remember that I actually posted a reel with picture hints of all the episodes that were going to be happening this season. And most of those haven't happened. Something really weird has been happening to me for the last several weeks. Every time I've gotten ready to just sit down and research the next episode I have planned, I've just been running into this wall. And, that's fairly common when it comes to research, but that's not the kind of wall that I'm talking about. It's just this like feeling that the episode that I'm sitting down to write or research or whatever is not the episode that I'm supposed to be doing that week. And I have listened to many other podcasts, and I've heard other people say things like this, like, oh, I had something else planned for this week, but like it just didn't feel right this week, or something else came up that it felt better or whatever. And not that I thought I was above this at all, but it happened to me quite a few times actually. So um it's really interesting, and it's been like this oddly intuitive and kind of and fulfilling experience, honestly. But I realize none of you knew about this, and you technically didn't need to know, but I just wanted to share a little bit of what's been going on behind the scenes here, um, and all of that. But anyway, again, that other episode will be coming out soon. So today, everybody, I'm very excited. Today, we are talking about the legendary Joan of Arc. Something interesting here, I've been using the word interesting a lot, is that I didn't know a lot about Joan before this episode. Even though she lived during the 100 Years' War, which is another area of history that I've specialized in during my schooling, my specialization in the 100 Years' War was a bit earlier. So I guess it makes some sense that I didn't know much, but since I'm really familiar with the era, it was actually really fun, like more fun than normal. And it's normally really fun to do research because it was kind of like I was filling in pieces to a puzzle that I'd already started. And that was wildly satisfying. Plus, in general, I've just always wanted to learn more about Joan of Arc. I have this like vague memory that comes up from my subconscious. I watched like a animated film about her once when I was little. I have no idea where it came from, what it was. It would be wild to find it again, but I remember like flashes of this film of watching it when I was younger. And I think that like instilled something in me because I remember watching it and being like, this doesn't make sense. I don't know why I don't know why this is happening. And so I think I just always wanted to know more. So Joan of Arc is a very well-known name in the world. I am expecting that most of you have at least heard the name Joan of Arc. which in and of itself is actually pretty impressive because we're launching ourselves back to medieval times again today, and even more than that, to medieval France. And as always, there is a lot of stuff to cover today, but it's going to be freaking awesome because Joan of Arc is actually one of the coolest people ever. I'm not kidding, guys. Unless you're like a monster of a human being, there's no way that you'll get to the end of this episode without Joan becoming one of your favorite people in the world. That's just the way that is. Okay, now one more thing before we dive in. This time it is pretty necessary, okay? I don't know if you've noticed this about me in every single episode we've done, but I am super here for like building the narrative and showmanship and all of that that comes with podcasting. Like every single week, I begin all the episodes all mysterious as if you didn't see the episode title and you already know why we're here. I just like, I'm, I'm like, in my head, it's not cool unless I have this like big reveal that literally never happens because, again, there's an episode title. But this week, I'm not even going to try to do that because I mean, in general, I'll admit it, the whole thing's pretty unnecessary, but also it would just make things a lot more confusing than they need to be today. There's a lot going on, there's a lot to cover. So we're not even going to do some big reveal. I'm not going to try to like build the narrative in that way. We're just going to tell you. Right off the bat, I'm going to tell you some of the bullet points of the life of Joan of Arc, and because it'll be really good for you to kind of have it in your brain as we go along, and then we won't have to stop as often and try and explain things in all of that. So it's also very possible that all or most of you know the things that, or even some of the things that I'm going to touch on today, but that's okay. Just come with me. So a few things you need to know about Joan of Arc. She fought for the French army in the 100 Years' War, which was a war that lasted just over 100 years between England and France. She was instrumental in getting the new king of France coronated. During this war, she was eventually captured by some allies of the English and then handed over to the English. Joan was then put on trial for heresy and, horrifically, executed by being burned at the stake. About 20 years after Joan's execution, her case was reopened for many reasons that we'll get into, and she was actually declared innocent posthumously. And don't worry, we're going to get into everything. But again, I just kind of want you to keep those things in your brain as a general framework because I think it will be helpful. So I'll repeat them. She fought for France against the English, got the king coronated, captured and put on trial for heresy, executed by burning, and posthumously declared innocent. But, like every other story, we need to start at the beginning. So come with me to medieval France and let's get going. Okay, my friends, we are not even 10 minutes into this podcast, and I just realized that I forgot to tell you something. This is going to be a two-part episode. Now, we've done a two-part episode before in season 1, our Winnie the Pooh episodes, which was so much fun. And I was not planning on Joan of Arc being a two-part episode. I did want to have a two-part episode in this season, but again, Joan of Arc was not the plan. But the more that I got into it and the more that I found, like, I just couldn't cut things out. So unless you guys wanted to be here for like 3.5 hours, I realized that we should probably cut into, which is fine. And it's going to be great. Another little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, this is France. We're in France, and I am American. I took French lessons for a year on Duolingo, and all I remember is croissant. So I'm going to do my best here. If I think I can pronounce it, I will try at least once. If I'm not even going to attempt it, I won't attempt it. And that's not out of disrespect. It's actually out of more respect. Anyway, so let's get into Joan's life. Okay. An interesting tidbit about this whole story is that we actually know quite a bit about Joan and her life, which is, for medieval times, pretty insane. But we know so much about it all because during her trial later, she was questioned a whole bunch about her life, and then all of it was recorded. So we have this pretty unique and fairly rich resource. It would be so wild if we had this for more people. Like, not a trial transcript, obviously, but just, more information. Anyway, so Joan of Arc was born in about 1412 in a small village in northeast France called Domremy. We don't know her exact date of birth, and her references to her age were actually fairly vague. It's possible that she didn't even know her birthday, honestly, but we're pretty sure that 1412 is the year that she was born. Joan was born to parents Jack Dark and Isabella Romay. Joan had three brothers and one sister. In what I found, I was able to find that two of her brothers were named Jean and Pierre. I didn't find a name for her other brother. Some sources said that her sister's name was Catherine, but others didn't say her name at all, so I'm not exactly sure. But we do know that she had two brothers named Jean and Pierre. Anyway, this family were peasant farmers with about 50 acres of land, and her father, Jack, supplemented their family's income as a village official. He collected taxes and also headed the local watch. And I just want to say right here at the very top of the episode, okay, there are people out there who say that Joan's later success as a leader came from the influence of her father working in the community. To this, I say garbage. Garbage. But we'll get into all of that later and you can make your own decision. Joan's youth was almost laughably stereotypical. And by that I mean that growing up, if you ever played medieval type games, because we all did that, don't come for me, and like somebody had to be a peasant girl from the country, you'd like do the whole basket on the hip thing and every like that was Joan's life. The stereotype exists for a reason, I get it, but she was a medieval girl in the countryside. She did household chores, she learned to spin wool, she helped in the fields, and helped with the farm animals. And, as was very common, the only education that she received was religious education, and this was provided by her mother, which was also very common. Joan did not learn to read or write. Now, we know that she later learned to at least write her name. Some sources say it's possible that she was able to eventually learn to both read and write, but we don't really know for sure. But again, religious education was provided by her mother, and remember, we're in medieval times and we're in medieval France, guys. So religion was everything. It is really really, really important, especially in Joan's case, to understand that religious education of pretty much everyone was very, very important. Much more important than learning to read and write, honestly. We're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. And because this is the time in history when Europe and the Roman Catholic Church are pretty much one and the same thing, again, reading and writing really aren't necessary for pretty much most people, but it was crucial for you to understand basic doctrine and prayers and things like that. That's what is important. And Joan's mother did a very good job teaching Joan and her siblings. Speaking of Joan's mother, we need to take just a tiny side road and talk about her parents for a minute because wildly enough, we've also got a pretty good amount of information about them and it's all very relevant to Joan's life. So let's start with Joan's dad, Jack. Apparently, when Joan was younger, he had recurring dreams of Joan going off to war around the same time that Joan herself was having these same dreams, and they hadn't communicated about this in any way. And he interpreted these dreams as a warning, since at the time the only women that were associated with going to war were sex workers. So he told his sons about these dreams, and he said that if these dreams came true, he wanted them to drown Joan or he would do it himself. And we're just gonna move on from that. He actually tried to marry her off to control her quote unquote deviant behavior, but she refused. He also attended the coronation festivities for the king later. I saw various sources as to when he died, that it was 1431 or 1440. I honestly don't know. But that's the overview on Joan's dad. Now we come to Joan's mother, the clearly superior parent, Isabelle Romay. She possibly got her last name from a pilgrimage to Rome because, interestingly enough, at this time, surnames weren't universal and it was somewhat common for wives to have different names than their husbands. And your last name, it was all really fluid, you know. Joan's mother may have gone on this pilgrimage to Rome and just decided to make that her last name. So Joan's mother, Isabel, lived in the city of Orleans around 1440 and got a pension from the city. All of this will make sense later. She sent a petition to the Pope for the rehabilitation trial or the retrial of Joan and addressed the court when it was finally granted, and she died 2 years after the conviction was overturned. She was over 70 years old when the trial began in the 1450s, okay? And she attended almost all of the sessions despite being really, really old for the time and in very poor health. My friends, that's a mom. So Joan's home village, Domremy, was, by the way, it's spelled Domremy. There's a possibility I'll just start calling it Domremy. You know what? I'll probably just start doing that. Anyway, this village was in a pretty precarious position, actually. And in order to explain this, we need to dive into the 100 Years' War very, very briefly. Now, I'm telling you this because it's not going to seem brief, but I promise you, this is the most wildly brief explanation of the 100 Years' War that you're ever going to get. So, and it will explain a lot of things that are going on here. So, let's begin with the 100 Years' War. This war was between England and France, and it began in the year 1337. It was essentially a war over the status of English territories in France and the claims that the English royalty had to the French throne. Now, the English royalty did have claims to the French throne. I want to make that very clear. My allegiances might be seeping through here a little bit. Here's the thing, friends. I'm an Anglo-Saxon English historian here. I've specialized in the early years of Britain in the 100 Years' War on the British side. So, like, it's pretty obvious where I'm standing here. But in these episodes, we're on the French side and we're learning about that, okay? But it is really important for you to know that the English did have legitimate claims to the French throne, and they did have several territories in France that were theirs. And because of all of this, that's why this war started. So nearly all of the fighting in this war had happened in France, and it had absolutely devastated the land and the economy. At the time of Joan's birth, France was very politically divided, which is not a good thing when you're in a war with somebody else. So the king at the time was King Charles VI, the king of France, and he had bouts of mental illness and he was often unable to rule. Now, his brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans, or Orleans probably is what I'll say, and his cousin, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, so his brother and his cousin, fought over the regency of the kingdom because, again, the king was often unable to rule. In 1407, John the Fearless ordered the assassination of Louis. Cousin has brother killed, okay? And this precipitates a civil war. Not good, okay? So Louis's heir is like 13, okay? He becomes the Duke of Orleans. And because he's young, he comes under the custody of the Count of Armagnac. And the supporters of this side of the family are called Armagnacs, and the supporters of John the Fearless are called Burgundians. That's really important for the rest of this story, okay? So basically, what I'm going to do to make this as clear as possible is that the Armagnacs are basically, we're just going to say that the Armagnacs are France as we think of it. The Burgundians are on the edge of France. Well, it's not totally accurate, but we're just going to say that. And the Burgundians were allied with the English. Okay, so remember that the Burgundians and the English are on the same side against the Armagnacs, who we're probably just going to refer to as the French army a lot of the time. So Charles VI, our kind of mentally ill king, had 12 children, and one of his sons, Charles, who would become Charles VII, was number 11, and he was the fifth son. This is wild, you guys. All four of his older brothers had died before they could inherit the throne or have children of their own. This is why they had so many kids. Like, it's absolutely insane. It's actually very, very sad. So the first child they had, Charles, he died as an infant. They had another Charles who died at the age of 9. They had a Louis who died at the age of 18 and a John who died at the age of 19. So Charles VI assumed the title of Dauphin. I have no idea if that's how you say it. I think it is. Anyway, this title means he's the heir to the throne. And he was about 14 when he takes this title. And this was after the last of the deaths of his brother, and about 14 1417. And Charles VI is also associated with the Armagnacs. They're France, okay? So let's talk about what England is doing in all of this a little bit. The king at the time is Henry V of England. He invaded in 1415 and completely exploited France's internal divisions, as one would do. The Burgundians, allies of the English, took Paris in 1418. In 1419, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, was assassinated during peace negotiations. You guys, he was murdered by the Dauphin's closest advisors. I'm not kidding. While he's in peace negotiations, the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, allies with the English. So this is all wild, okay? So Charles VI accused his son, the Dauphin. I'll probably start saying not that, but anyway, he accused his son of murder and said that he was unfit to inherit the French throne. So then this king, Charles VI, became ill for a time, and his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, stood in for him and signed the Treaty of Troyes. That's not correct, but we're saying it that way. Signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This treaty did a couple of things. It gave their daughter, Catherine of Valois, to marriage to Henry V, and it granted succession of the French throne to their heirs, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin and, just saying to Charles' son, Charles, you're done. And this actually caused a ton of rumors that Charles was not actually the legitimate son of Charles VI, that he was a product of an affair between the mother and John the Fearless. I mean, it was wild, you guys. It was insane. And I don't, it's just, okay, let's move on. In 1422, just a couple years later, Henry V and Charles VI died within 2 months of each other. And this made 9-month-old Henry VI of England the nominal heir to the Anglo-French dual monarchy, as per the treaty. This is what I'm going to translate that for you. This is what this means. Both of these kings died, and because of this treaty, it means that Henry and Catherine's children get to inherit both the English throne and the French throne. Their child was 9 months old, so he is now the heir to the thrones of England and France. However, the Dauphin Charles claimed the French throne anyway. I think it's pretty metal, but anyway, let's return to the beginning of this little section, to Joan's home village. This village was in a very precarious situation because they were pro-Armagnac. They supported Charles and they wanted England to go away, essentially. However, this village and the area that it was in were completely surrounded by pro-Burgundian and pro-English lands. So it's kind of just this little pocket in the middle of enemy territory. Thus, it makes sense that in about 1425, Domremy was attacked and a bunch of their cattle were stolen. And the villagers were even more pro-Armagnac after this, as you can imagine. And the widespread sentiment in the town was that the only way there would ever be peace in France is if the English were completely driven out. And it was after this raid in 1425 that our girl Joan had her very first vision. In her trial later, Joan of Arc testified that in 1425, the year of this raid, she was about 13 years old, and that this was when she received her very first vision, in which Saint Michael, surrounded by other angels, appeared to her while she was out in the garden. And she said that after this vision, she wept because she wanted to go with them, which is actually really quite beautiful. So, according to Joan, she had visions of Saint Michael all throughout her life, who was the patron saint of the area and had been seen as the defender of France. She said that these visions happened frequently and often when church bells rang. Her visions also included Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. Now, there were many Saints Margaret and Catherine. obviously common names, but we're assuming that they are the St. Margaret and St. Catherine that were very well known in Joan's area at the time. And these saints were virgin saints who had strived. They had fought against powerful enemies. And they had both been tortured and martyred for their beliefs, and they had preserved their virtue to the death. So Joan also later testified that she swore a vow of virginity to these voices. Now, a young man from her village alleged that she had broken a promise of marriage. Remember her dad trying to marry her off? And if this was true, then it's actually a legal matter. Like that's a thing you can take before the court and say, "Hey, she broke this off." Like I'm pressing charges basically. She stated that she had made him no promises and the case was dismissed. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about an official court at this time siding with a young girl over a boy's allegations and her father's wishes. An absolute miracle, people. That's the only way that this happened. Like, it's an absolute miracle. So, there's a very brief background on Joan's visions. That's all you need to know for this point in the story. There's a lot more that we're definitely going to be talking about later, but just keep that in your pocket. So, real talk, everybody. Everything about this case is fascinating, truly. But this little part that we're at it's just chef's kiss spectacular, okay? All during Joan's youth, there were prophecies circulating throughout the French countryside. You heard me correctly, prophecies. And yes, this is real life and not a fantasy novel, okay? There were prophecies circulating around the French countryside that everyone knew and believed in. And these prophecies were that an armed virgin would come forth to save France, and the other one was that a virgin carrying a banner would put an end to France's suffering. In addition to these prophecies, there was also a popular saying that France would be destroyed by a woman, but would be restored by a virgin. So everybody knows this saying and everybody knows these prophecies. And since Domremy and a lot of France are actually suffering quite a bit at the hands of the English, all of this is probably even more potent, truly. And Joan is just standing there like, guys, it's me. I'm the virgin. Basically, that's probably what she said verbatim. Thus, in May of 1428, Joan asked her uncle to take her to a nearby garrison town. Now, this is obviously still in the Domremy area that was pro Armagnac. Also, she asked her uncle and not her dad, which is not surprising. Anyway, at this garrison, she petitioned the garrison commander for an armed escort to the royal court at Chinon. This is where the Dauphin Charles was, and it was the capital of Armagnac stuff going on, because remember, the Burgundians have Paris. The garrison commander heard her out and then said, LOL, no. He was actually a lot more harsh than that. He basically told her that she was insane, that it was a hard no. He was not going to provide an escort for her through enemy territory to tell the king about her visions, and then he sent her home. A few months later, in July of 1428, Domremy was attacked again by Burgundian forces, and this time it was much worse than before. The entire town was set on fire, all of the crops were destroyed, and all of the people had to flee. So, as you can imagine, that probably wasn't very much fun. So, Joan returned to the garrison again 6-ish months later, January of 1429, and her petition was refused again. However, there were soldiers at this garrison that had heard her story and they had started to believe in her. She had gained their support, which is very interesting and very important. Now, another interesting fun tidbit that's not relevant, but I'm going to tell you because it's a funny story. So, I'm not going to say that Joan was like famous at this time. She wasn't, but like in the area, some people had heard about her. And there's this guy, okay, his name is Charles II. He's the Duke of Lorraine. And he probably heard about her just from some of the higher ups from the garrison, etc. So he hears about this girl who allegedly has visions, right? And he summons her under safe conduct to his bedside because he is very, very ill. And he says, hey, I've heard about you, and I think that you might have supernatural powers that can cure me because I'm very ill. Joan then said, like, hey, no, I don't have any cures for you. But then she did reprimand him for living with his mistress, which is hysterical. And he did get better, by the way. So at this time, most of northern France, Paris, and parts of southwestern France were all under Anglo Burgundian control. They also controlled the city of Reims. It's spelled Reims, and I'm doing my best here. I am very aware that you do not pronounce this city Reims. However, I'm probably going to pronounce it that way. I'm just going to say that right now. This city is very, very important in this story. That's why I'm making this very clear. I know that that's not how you pronounce it, but I'm doing my best, okay? The Anglo-Burgundian army controlled most of northern France, Paris, and parts of southwestern France. And they also controlled this city, Reims, which was the traditional site for the coronation of French kings. Now, here's the thing. Our buddy Charles has not yet been crowned. He has claimed the French throne as his, but he's not technically been crowned the king yet. And doing so at Reims would help legitimize his claim to the throne, because remember, because of that treaty, it's a little shaky. Some people don't believe that he's Charles VI's real son, etc. In July of 1428, just we're backing up a teeny bit, the city of Orleans was surrounded pretty much by the English, and it was nearly isolated from the rest of Charles's territory. I just hit my microphone. I'm sorry. It was a very important city, this city. It was the last obstacle for the English in order to assault the remainder of Charles's territory. So this city is like all they have left, basically, before the English can just run in and really take everything over. So when this city becomes surrounded and nearly completely cut off and besieged, it's a really big deal. And Joan later testified that around this time, her visions were urging her to leave Domremy and to help Charles. So she got a third meeting with the garrison commander the next month in February of 1429. Around this time, the English army had captured the relief convoy bound for Orleans to aid the Armagnac cause. And so not only is Orleans, again, I know that's not how you say it, okay? I'm here. I'm trying. Just I pronounced it pretty good earlier anyway. I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm doing my best and that's it, okay? Around this time, the English had captured a relief convoy bound for Orleans. So not only is this very, very important town surrounded and under siege, they can't get the supplies that they need, and it's everybody's freaking out, right? So with the support of these soldiers at the garrison, Joan finally convinces the commander to help her get to Chinon to have an audience with the Dauphin. And she travels with an escort of 6 soldiers to go through enemy territory to get there. Now, her escorts and the people of the garrison provided her with men's clothing so that she would be safer as they traveled through enemy territory. And she continued to wear men's clothing for the rest of her life. And yes, before you even ask, we're absolutely going to be talking more about Joan's whole wardrobe later, because it actually turns out to be a really, really big deal. So stay tuned for that. Joan arrived at the royal court in Chinon on February 23rd, 1429, with her soldier escorts, as well as a recommendation letter from the garrison commander so that she would be able to meet with Charles. And the Dauphin, Charles, met Joan for the first time very shortly after her arrival. At this time, she was 17 years old and he was 26. Now, there is a sort of legend about what happened when Joan met Charles for the first time. It comes from secondhand witness testimony, so people who were not present, but it's pretty interesting, so I'm going to include it anyway. Allegedly, Charles wanted to test her claim that she was able to recognize him despite never having seen him. Listen, I've done lots of research and I haven't heard that she ever made this claim, but okay, apparently she made this claim and he wanted to test it. So, he disguised himself as one of his courtiers, and he stood in their midst when Joan entered the chamber and in which everybody was assembled. And Joan allegedly identified Charles immediately. She bowed low to him, embraced his knees, and declared, "God give you a happy life. sweet king. There's a lot to unpack with this story, but again, it's likely fabricated. Interesting though. What we do know is that Joan told Charles that she had come to rage the siege at Orleans and to lead him to Reims to be coronated. This all happened during their very first private exchange, and we also know that during this meeting, Joan made a very strong impression on Charles. Joan's confessor, um, he actually later testified that Joan had told him that during this meeting, she reassured Charles that he was the legitimate son of Charles VI and therefore the rightful king. Another source I found mentioned that in this private audience, Joan allegedly won Charles over by revealing information that only a messenger from God could know, and that the details of this conversation are unknown. Honestly, I really don't know if that's actually the legitimate child of King Charles VI thing or something else. As we've discovered, there are a lot of things said about this meeting. And honestly, I would not be surprised if we really didn't know anything about what really happened in this meeting. Joan did testify about it later in her trial, but she also refused to answer a lot of questions about it. And I'm inclined to believe, again, that we really don't know pretty much anything about what happened. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the trial. So, I don't like this part, but here we are. Even though Charles was super really impressed with Joan from this meeting and probably pretty convinced that she was the real deal, the inevitable happened. And by that I mean it's the old times, okay? Charles and his council decided that they actually needed some more reassurance that Joan was legit. So they sent her to be examined by two different groups of people. The first group of people was a council of theologians who declared that she was a good person and a good Catholic. They also issued no statement of any kind. They rendered no decision on the source of her inspiration, but they did agree that sending her to Orleans would be useful to the king and would also test the divine origin of her inspiration. The second group of people she was sent to was a group of women directed by Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon. She was sent to these women to be physically examined, and they verified her virginity. And okay, I am a medievalist, friends. We all know this. I say it a lot. It's probably annoying. So, yes, I'm very, very aware of how things were back then. And thus, this whole physical examination to confirm her virginity that Joan had to undergo isn't surprising. It all checks out. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't seriously irk me. Now, I'm not going to go into the logistics or specifics of how her virginity would be verified, but you can probably use your imagination and figure it out, do some research, or message me, whatever. But anyway, this is unsettling for a lot of reasons. Mostly because, I mean, let's face it, it's wildly messed up. But also, like, that's not the avenue that we're here to go down, so I'll move on. But I just find it very important to make sure that we all know that this sort of thing makes all the sense in the world for the time period. It's not cool, but it makes sense. Okay, we're all on the same page. Great. So, all right. What was the purpose of them establishing or confirming that Joan was actually a virgin? Because it kind of makes sense that they would send her to the churchmen to like see if she was a good Catholic, right? But why did they need to establish her virginity? Well, first of all, it would satisfy the base requirement of these prophecies. If she wasn't a virgin, obviously she couldn't be the virgin savior of France. So they had to check that box. It would also show the purity of her devotion, because obviously she could not be pure and devoted unless she was a virgin. And finally, it would ensure that she hadn't consorted with the devil. This has ties to witchcraft, everybody, which I'm going to briefly explain. In the whole witchcraft part of history, there is a thought that witches become witches by sleeping with the devil, or that they sleep with the devil regularly. There's a lot of things going on. But again, this would ensure that that had not happened. So, all of these results, from the churchmen to the physical examination, were delivered to Charles, and he and his advisors were thus reassured that Joan was the real deal. So, Charles proceeded to commission plate armor for her. She designed her own banner, and she had a sword brought to her from under the altar in a church that was dedicated to St. Catherine. Around this time, Joan began calling herself Joan the Maiden. And for those of you who may not know, maiden is another word for virgin. By calling herself this, she was emphasizing her virginity as a sign of her mission, because again, the prophecy. This brings us to an aspect of Joan's whole experience that we have not addressed yet, but is actually really important. So we need to talk about it. We need to talk a little bit more about Joan's name. Her given name, of course, but also the names that she was known by. So if you'll remember, her mom had a different last name than her dad, and she might have come upon this last name because she went on a religious journey to Rome. I'm reminding you of this to demonstrate that names were very fluid back then in many, many ways. For example, as far as spelling went, Joan's name was written in a variety of ways. There was no standard spelling of it before the 16th century. And her last name at the time was usually written as Dark without the apostrophe, so just Darc. But there were also variants such as Tark, Dart, or Day. At her trial, her father's name was written as Tart, which is very intriguing. Charles VII, in a 1429 letter granting Joan her own coat of arms, called her Jeanne d'Ormemy. So there's that, okay? And here's the other interesting thing. Joan may have never heard herself called Joan of Arc. The first written record of her being called by this name is in 1455, 24 years after her death. By the 16th century, so the 1500s, Joan was popularly known as the Maid of Orleans. Now remember, my friends, Joan could not read or write, but she very much sent a lot of letters to very important people, which she obviously had dictated to a scribe. In these letters, Joan referred to herself as Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maiden, or simply La Pucelle, the Maiden, again emphasizing her virginity. But the reason that we think she may have learned to write is because she would sign her letters. If she didn't actually learn to write, she at least learned to write her name very well. And she would sign her name as Jehanne. But again, Joan. So let's regroup. Let's pause for a minute and regroup, recap, get the bearings of where we're at in our story, okay? We're in the year 1429, and Joan is about 17 years old. She's been having heavenly visions since she was 13. She has finally gotten an audience with the Dauphin Charles and told him that she can help save France and also see that he gets properly coronated. Charles agrees to this and he gets her everything that she's going to need to go to battle. Let's just review for a second overall, like where the war's over at. Okay, what's all going on there. Before Joan got to Chinon, the Armagnac strategic situation was pretty bad, but it wasn't hopeless, okay? Their forces were prepared to endure a long siege at Orleans, even though a siege is really terrible and there were a lot of things going on. As in, here's the thing, guys. The Burgundians had actually withdrawn from the siege due to disagreements about territory, and since their allies had left the siege, the English were debating about whether or not to continue the siege or withdraw themselves. But even though these things were positive for the Armagnacs, they were happening behind the scenes and not necessarily going to happen. Like the English weren't necessarily going to leave, right? And the Armagnacs don't know that this is happening, and they are very, very demoralized after a century of war. It had been quite a while since the French had had any major gains in the war, and the English had been successful for a long time. So the Armagnacs are doing their best here, but it was almost like a going through the motion situation. Their faith in their ability to be victorious in any way was very, very low. However, once Joan had joined the Dauphin's cause, she immediately raised everybody's spirits. She inspired devotion and the hope of divine assistance. Now, Joan's belief in the divine origin of her mission was unparalleled. Like she believed in this with every piece of herself. And it turned this war that had been raging over inheritance and rights to thrones and everything, it kind of turned it into a religious conflict in a lot of ways. Before leaving for Orleans, Joan dictated a letter to the Duke of Bedford who was the English regent at the time, so ruling England, and she warned him that she was sent by God to drive him out of France. Think about this in relation to the demoralized Armagnac army. First of all, they've all most likely heard this prophecy. Second of all, the person who has supposedly been prophesied about is there to save them, and she is this out of this world confident and just bold about who she is little girl, basically. And she just knows what she's there to do. I mean, you guys, she's writing a letter to the English leader telling him to get out of her way, which at this point, she's not done anything significant for the war. She's just showing up and like being confident and saying like she doesn't have any grounds or any position to say any of this, right? But she does. I really don't think that we can overstate or even comprehend just what Joan's existence did for the French army, just on an emotional or mental level. Again, before she had even really done anything. So Joan has the permission and the blessing and all of that from the Dauphin, and he's agreed to send her to help lift the siege of Orleans. She left Chinon and traveled to Orleans as part of a relief army that was being sent there carrying supplies. And Joan and this army arrived safely outside Orleans on April 29th, 1429. Now remember, my friends, the city was almost completely surrounded by the English and almost completely cut off. However, it was not 100% surrounded or cut off. So the French commander in Orleans was able to get Joan into the city once she arrived. And remember, again, at this point, all Joan has done is get there. That's literally all she's done is get there. That's it. But everybody in that city was wild about her. There are countless paintings portraying Joan's entrance into the city. We're talking crowds surrounding her, trying to touch her. Everybody was so happy that she was there, so happy to see her. They truly believed that she was there to save them and that she absolutely would save them. So everybody in the government is semi-convinced, at least, that Joan is the real deal. But all the soldiers and all the common people are 100% devoted to her and convinced that she is their savior. And obviously, as we talked about a little bit earlier, this is going to do amazing things for everybody's morale. And as far as Joan's official role in things went, that's actually where the government officials really placed her. In other words, Joan was initially treated as a figurehead to raise morale, which she did without even trying, right? She was meant to be on the battlefield and fly her banner, but she was not given any formal command or included in military councils. I mean, all of that checks out, but anyway, that's what happened. So, however, Joan very quickly gained the love and support of all the soldiers. And even though she was just meant to be like where she could be seen and wave a banner, on the battlefield, Joan somehow was always present where the fighting was the most intense. She was pretty much all the time on the very front lines of the battle. By doing this, she gave her fellow soldiers a sense that she was fighting for their salvation, that she was really there for them. And even though Joan had no formal command in any way in the army, the military commanders that she interacted with all the time often accepted advice from her, such as deciding what positions to attack, when to continue an assault, how to place artillery. It's just, I don't know. Anyway, so Joan arrived in Orleans on April 29th. A few days later, on May 4th, the Armagnacs are suddenly on the offensive, and they begin to attack a nearby fortress. Joan learns of this attack and she rides out with her banner. This is about a mile away from the city of Orleans, and she arrives as her fellow French soldiers were retreating because the assault had failed. However, when she gets there, the soldiers rally, they attack again, and they take the fortress. The next day is May 5th, and this is a feast day in the Catholic Church. It's called Ascension Thursday, and because of that, there was no fighting, which I love. On this religious day off, Joan took her downtime to dictate another letter to the English. In this letter, she warned them again to leave France. She had it tied to a bolt and fired by a crossbowman into the English area. My dudes, my buddies, my pals, that is metal as crap, okay? That is it's so freaking cool. It's so freaking cool. Okay, so now I'm not sure if what I'm about to tell you is complete fact or somewhat legend or whatever, but I found one source that actually has what this letter said, and it is so beyond description that I must read it to you. So, according to this source, this letter that she had fired on the crossbow bolt read, "You men of England, you have no right in this kingdom of France. The King of Heaven orders and commands you through me, Joan the Maid, to abandon your strongholds and go back to your own country. If not, I will make a war cry that will be remembered forever." I am of the opinion that there are not words in any language to explain or to describe in any way how incredible that letter is. So I'm not going to. We're just going to continue. The next day, on May 6th, the Armagnac forces resumed the offensive, and they captured yet another town that had been deserted by the English. And at this point, all of the other commanders, they want to stop. They just want to stop and consolidate their gains, honestly. They had taken this other fortress and now another town. They just want to just pause a bit and get their bearings, which is pretty fair, honestly. But Joan of Arc refuses to quit, my friends, and she urges them to continue on and launch an assault on another English fortress that was nearby. Well, they took her advice, they launched the assault, and they ended up capturing the fortress. And again, the commanders are like, okay, cool, we've had some victories. Let's take a breather for a minute. But again, Joan encouraged them to keep going and continue on the offensive. Which brings us to the morning of May 7th, when the Armagnacs attacked the main English stronghold, Les Tourlots. And come with me on this, okay? Come with me, my friends. Joan and the French armies have just been knocking victories out of the park. They have captured 3 English strongholds in only a few days. And now they are attacking the main English stronghold in the area. And because Joan is the way that she was fighting with her fellow soldiers in a trench. And she's in the thick of fighting. She's flying her banner and encouraging everybody onward. And she is wounded. An arrow hits her between her shoulder and her neck. And obviously, this is a little scary. I mean, the arrow hit her in a pretty bad spot. And the Middle Ages aren't exactly known for their medical expertise. But you guys, you don't need to worry about Joan ever, okay? She was taken from the fighting to have her wound tended to. And then later, she returned to the battlefield to encourage the final assault that ended up taking the fortress. Legendary. Legendary. Okay. So the next morning, May 8th, 1429, the English officially retreated from Orleans and the siege, excuse me, not the sage, the siege was lifted. Not only had the siege been lifted, but as we just discussed, several English strongholds in the area were gained by the French army. I think we can safely say that Joan had made good on her promises. And as early as the very day that the siege was lifted, celebrations have been held almost every year in Orleans celebrating the lifting of the siege and commemorating Joan's part in it. That's right, my friends. They are still held today. So everybody hop on over to Orleans, France next May and celebrate Joan, okay? Do it. All right. Now take a moment, everybody. Take just a moment to remember that when Joan was finally given an audience with the Dauphin earlier that year in Chinon, she boldly declared to Charles that she had been sent by God to help him. As we know, she was sent to various examinations in order to establish the legitimacy of this claim. In one of these examinations, she met with the Council of Churchmen, who eventually pretty much gave her a stamp of approval, right? But something that we didn't talk about earlier also happened in this meeting. This council of theologians asked Joan to show them some kind of sign to demonstrate her claim of divine inspiration. And this woman replied that if she were brought to Orleans, the sign they were seeking would be given. Well, having helped lift the siege of Orleans just as she promised, as well as helping gain many other strongholds in the area, a lot of people began to say that these were definitely the signs and that she had in fact been sent by God. In fact, the Archbishop of Embrun, as well as a prominent theologian, Jean Gerson, both wrote treatises in support of Joan after these victories. In contrast, the English thought it was proof that she was possessed by the devil. This checks out because obviously they can't believe she was sent by God. So, after the success of Orleans, Joan insisted that the Armagnac forces advance promptly to Reims to coronate the Dauphin. Because remember, this is really the main part of her mission, okay? Having the Dauphin Charles properly coronated and consecrated as France's rightful king. That's her mission. Lifting the siege at Orleans had really been a means to an end in this case. However, at this point, advancing directly to Reims would mean recapturing 3 bridge towns along the Loire River to clear the way for Charles to cross from Chinon to Reims. So Charles allowed Joan to participate in this campaign to recapture these 3 towns, and he assigned her to accompany the army of John II, Duke of Alencon. John often this Duke John often collaborated with Joan and took her advice. They knew each other. This campaign, known as the Loire campaign, began on June 11th, 1429, just a few days after the siege was lifted. So let's talk about this campaign. Obviously, my friends, these 3 towns have names, but I've been throwing a lot of names at you and a lot of places at you. So I'm going to refer to them as town number 1, town number 2, and town number 3. I hope that's cool with all of you. So, town number 1. Once the French army drew near, the English army in this area withdrew behind the town walls and refused to surrender. So Joan said, "Alrighty, we'll launch a direct assault in the morning," which they did. And by the end of the day, the town was taken. And here's something, okay, so the Armagnacs, the French army, did not take prisoners. So they killed the people who surrendered. I'm not into this. It's skeevy, and that's the truth. I don't think we have any way of knowing what Joan's part in this was, if she had any, but I don't like that. Anyway, in fact, during this assault, Joan, as always, was serving in the thick of battle. Can we talk about how she got shot in the shoulder neck area like 4 days earlier and she's in battle again? Okay, thank you. So she began to scale one of those really large siege ladders that were against the wall. And of course, she's still holding her banner as she's climbing this ladder. And she was hit in the head by a rock, okay? And it was powerful enough that it split her helmet. She wasn't technically wounded, okay? She was okay. But I'd say that's a recipe for a serious concussion. So, she probably wasn't really herself for a few days. I think we could say that safely. Let's move on to town number 2. On June 15th, the French army took control of this town's bridge, and the English garrison in this town withdrew to a nearby castle. Most of Joan's army, the French army, continued on to town number 3 in order to besiege it. So, town number 2, it wasn't super eventful, but they did end up getting it because the English abandoned it. And again, the bulk of the army continued on to town number 3. So, town number 3. Meanwhile, there's an English army being sent from Paris to help relieve town number 3. And this army happens to link up with the retreating garrison army from town number 2. However, the English garrison at town number 3 did not know this. They didn't know that they had reinforcements or supplies on the way. So they surrendered to the Armagnac forces on June 18th, after which the main English army retreated towards Paris. So we've got our 3 towns, right? We've been successful in the outright mission here. But don't forget, everybody, we're in the company of Joan of Arc. So what do you think happened next? Not surprisingly, Joan urged the Armagnac forces to pursue the retreating English army. And later that day, the French army caught up with the English army in an encounter known as the Battle of Patay. And this battle, this is what happened, all right? Obviously, the English are in the lead, but at some point they realized they weren't going to outrun the French army. So instead, the English prepared to ambush the army with hidden archers. However, The Armagnac vanguard detected them and scattered the archers, and the English army proceeded to get decimated. The commander of the army escaped with a very small band of soldiers, but many of the English leaders were captured. Joan actually arrived at the battlefield too late to participate in any of the action, but it was her encouragement that made them even pursue the English and therefore made the victory possible. So I just want to break this down a little bit. Let's talk about this, okay? The French army was probably exhausted at this point from constant campaigning, fighting, marching in the last many, many days, okay? This English army is much fresher because most of them are a relief army from Paris. I mean, granted, they've all been marching for quite a ways, but by all accounts, all of them are more rested and therefore should be good to go. And the French army just freaking runs them over, really. I believe that it's actually a lot more powerful that Joan was not present at this battle until after it was already won. The soldiers probably knew that they were acting on her encouragement, and they still went for it and won the battle without her there. In my opinion, this speaks even more to the positive influence that she had on everybody, okay? They believed in her just as much as she believed that she was on a mission from God, which was a lot. If nothing else, no matter what you believe about this, truly, like this just clearly brought a very powerful sense of unity to the Armagnac forces that hadn't been felt in a very, very long time. So, after this victory, the Armagnac leaders had apparently finally caught the vision of just going for it and continuing on the offensive. A lot of them decided that it would be a really great idea to invade Normandy, which was very, very, very much English territory. However, Joan reminded them what was most important here. She insisted that they continue on to Reims so that Charles could be crowned. And Charles agreed. So, on June 29th, the French army started marching towards Reims. And now remember, okay, this is still in territory that the English technically occupy. Okay, they haven't completely reclaimed the whole area yet. However, they marched to this city pretty much unopposed. Most towns along the way did not resist at all. Like they basically just let the army in, or they either surrendered very, very quickly. So they arrive at the city of Reims in July, and the city opens its gates to them on July 16th, 1429. That evening, Charles, Joan, and the entire French army entered the city. And the next morning, July 17th, 1429, the Dauphin Charles was consecrated King Charles VII of France. And Joan was given a place of honor at the ceremony, and thereafter announced that God's will had been fulfilled. Now, there is something that I need to emphasize here. Maybe even clarify some questions that you might have, or even to just drive a point home. Okay, we need to talk for a minute about a few different things. We need to talk about. Okay, that was an unnecessarily long pause. Okay, we need to talk about this consecration of Charles because obviously he was being coronated as the king, but it's also referred to as a consecration because it's a religious ceremony. And this kind of ties into the whole um, divine right of kings, etc. You know, there's a lot going on here, but that's one of the reasons that having the coronation at Reims was so important because it was the traditional religious site where the kings were consecrated by holy men to be the kings of France. So, I mean, that's why it was crucial for Charles to be coronated here because that helps with his legitimacy, right? And Joan's whole role in this is just fascinating and honestly really beautiful. I've saved this moment of clarification or emphasis or whatever for now because we've been through a lot up to this point, and now we're here. So I just think it works. I just think it works a little bit better. Joan is clearly so religious and so devoted to her God and to her cause. And she truly, truly believed that Charles was chosen by God as the rightful king of France. And not only this, Joan loved her country and was fighting to defend her country. And we have this whole divine right of kings. We have this whole religious aspect to this that would have been very, very powerful for everybody. You know what, you should take a class on it because we don't have time to go into it right now. Like, there is so much going on here. The fact that Charles was able to get to the correct city, to be coronated, to be consecrated, is crucial. It is so important. And honestly, this moment where Charles is finally consecrated in the correct place is an incredibly powerful moment in history. And it's probably to the point that we can't even fully wrap our minds around because we just don't think that way anymore. But imagine it if you can. I'm sure that people were gathered in the streets. The army was there. Joan had gone through many, many battles at this point to help get her king coronated and consecrated. And I'm just sure that it was a very emotional and, I'm going to say it, spiritual experience. Again, I just think it was a very powerful, powerful moment. I mean, obviously, it's a crucial moment in history, but if you had been there, I don't think you would be able to argue that it didn't feel powerful, that it didn't feel significant. And I'm sure that it was an unbelievable experience for Joan herself. Okay, guys, so we've done it. We did it. Okay, we did it. Okay, Charles is coronated, and things are pretty good. Okay, like we're feeling pretty good. However, there is still a war going on, and even though France has done quite well recently, we're really far away from resolving things permanently. And remember, at this point, the war has been going on for almost 100 years. Okay, and suffice it to say, people are a little bit tired, okay? Not just the common people, like everyone. Everyone from the peasants to the king is tired of the war, especially in France because it has decimated their country in every way, okay? But here's the other thing. Peace negotiations between the English and the French had been going on and off for years, actually. None of them obviously had ever panned out, but they had been trying for many years. So, after Charles VII was coronated, the royal court negotiated a 15-day truce with our friend, well, he's really not our friend, but the Duke of Burgundy. And he promised to arrange the transfer of Paris to the Armagnac forces while they continued more permanent peace negotiations. However, at the end of this 15-day truce, it turned out that the Duke of Burgundy decided not to keep his promise. I mean, stuff like this was not surprisingly the reason that permanent peace negotiations had never really been successful. It's kind of weird. So, in response to this whole debacle, Joan and the Duke of Alencon, remember him, they wanted to gather up their army again and begin a swift march on Paris, right? But it was not to be, okay? There were some divisions in the royal court, and they were still in peace negotiations with Burgundy and England. So all of it was kind of complicated, and they did start to march for Paris, but it was a lot slower than they were hoping for. Not great, okay? But the good news was that as the Armagnac army did approach Paris, most towns along the way surrendered without a fight or without much trouble at all. So that's good. So this brings us to the Siege of Paris, to August 15th, 1429. Well, okay, I lied to you. We're actually not in Paris yet. However, the French army runs into the English army on the way there. Okay. And they kind of find themselves in this like face off type situation on the battlefield. However, the Burgundian / English army had a much stronger position than the Armagnacs. And so Joan and the Duke of Alencon knew it wasn't smart for them to be the ones to attack. So, our girl Joan rode out in front of the English forces with her banner, trying to provoke them into attacking. Take a minute to think about this. I've been trying really hard to just not constantly be calling Joan a queen at every turn in this episode, but she is a queen, everyone. Like, truly, she's just riding out in front of this army, like, hey, come at me. She's so great. Anyway. However, the English did not take the bait, and this resulted in a standoff. And then the English actually retreated the next day. I honestly have no idea why they would do this when they had the higher ground. Nevertheless, that is what happened. So, the Armagnac forces continue their advance towards Paris, and they launched the assault on Paris on September 8th, 1429. Now, I've been trying to imagine what this must have been like. The French army, headed by Joan of Arc, launching an assault on the huge walls of medieval Paris. This is definitely different from any of the places that they have assaulted and taken thus far. I mean, it's the walls of medieval Paris, So I'm sure that it was probably wildly intimidating, to say the least, and very, very intense for sure. In fact, Joan was once again wounded during this assault. Come with me for this story. She was struck in the leg with a crossbow bolt, and she actually remained in the trench beneath the city walls until after nightfall when she was rescued. Okay, can you imagine this? Okay, in this day, the Armagnacs suffered 1,500 casualties, okay? And Joan was left in the trenches among many of them, waiting for who knows how long, with a crossbow bolt stuck in her leg, okay? And knowing Joan, I'm sure she was eager to just get patched up and back on the battlefield the next morning. However, the next morning, King Charles ordered an end to the assault. You heard me correctly. Joan was pretty upset, which makes sense, and she wanted the attack to continue. Plus, she'd just been wounded the night before, okay? So there's that. And here's the other thing. This assault had only lasted for a day, and it's a huge city, right? It probably felt like they hadn't even really gotten started or gotten any kind of a fair shot at this assault. So she and the Duke of Alencon made new plans for a different attack on Paris. However, King Charles dismantled a bridge that approaches Paris that was necessary for this new plan of attack. Don't ask me why, because I have no idea. I have no idea at all why he would do this. And don't forget, okay, it wasn't just Joan here who wants to keep going and is making plans, okay? We also have a very seasoned soldier and military commander in the Duke of Alencon who is right there with her, trying to successfully take Paris. But nevertheless, Charles decided that it was completely necessary and very smart to dismantle a perfectly good bridge and call off the attack. And thus, the Armagnac army had to retreat. Okay, so we didn't get Paris. And what happens next? Well, I'll tell you. After this quote unquote defeat, the French court began to lose faith in Joan of Arc. And from then on, her role in the royal court was much diminished. I don't think that we have time in any plane of existence to dive into how I feel about this. So we're just going to move on for a minute and just to some more practical sides of this, okay? One thing that can be said about Joan was that she was aggressively independent, okay? We've already seen that. When it came to her mission or to the future of France, Joan was not willing to compromise. And this really did not agree with the whole court in general, who wanted to come to a diplomatic solution with the Duke of Burgundy so that they could win the war. I mean, so that the war could stop, right? They wanted peace. And now that Joan has been quote unquote defeated, these differences, these facts have become even more prominent, I would say, especially since now like the main missions are finished, right? And so, as it would happen, some were already saying that Joan hadn't been able to take Paris because her inspiration was not divine after all. Or maybe, just maybe, just okay, it's a suggestion, okay, but maybe Joan wasn't able to take Paris because Charles didn't let her do her freaking job. Maybe you think maybe maybe if the king had just let her do her freaking job, I don't know, like I don't know. I don't know. Maybe if the king had let her do her freaking job, maybe if the king had let her do her job. But that's not all. So, as if we're not already upset enough, my friends, a few weeks later, late September, Charles disbanded the French army, and Joan was not allowed to work with the Duke of Alencon ever again. So I honestly I don't have it in me to go into that because my emotions are pretty much already shot. In case you didn't get that vibe. So let's move ahead just 1 month to October 1429. Joan was sent as part of a force to attack the territory of a mercenary who had worked with both the English and the Burgundians. The army besieged the fortress where Joan, as always, encouraged a direct assault, and the fortress fell into their hands on November 4th. A success here, which is really good, obviously. But next, they moved on to another town and another siege in late November/early December. Unfortunately for Joan and her army, this siege was unsuccessful. They were not able to take the town, and even worse than that, they had to abandon their artillery as they were retreating. And I think that since we had just had this success the month before, what made this defeat even worse was the fact that they had to abandon the artillery. Because here's the thing, guys, it's the 1400s, so it's not easy to make a cannon and to carry it around with you. So they're really, really important. And if you have to abandon them, that's really bad. So that's probably what irked people the most, honestly. And of course, this defeat diminished Joan's reputation even further, because why wouldn't it? So she returns to the royal court at Chinon at the end of December. And when she arrives there, she learns that she and her family have been ennobled by King Charles for her services to him and the kingdom. Now, there actually isn't a bunch of information on this, like more specifically how Joan felt about becoming a noble. But, that honestly makes sense because, as we know, Joan was just committed to the cause. I think that she was okay with being rewarded. But again, we don't really know how she felt about it, to be honest. So I think she was probably just like, oh, like, okay, that's cool, um I don't know, we could probably unpack that, but we're not going to. So this is also when we learn that King Charles has actually arranged a 4-month peace truce with the Duke of Burgundy. And there's more. That we learned that this truce had been agreed upon before they tried to take Paris in September. So, okay, let's just pause. Let's pause for a minute and talk about this, okay? King Charles and the Duke of Burgundy agreed upon a 4-month truce as they were marching to Paris, probably. And then Charles proceeded to allow an attack on Paris anyway, and then called it off long before it could ever get started, probably because of this truce. And then he was more than happy to let Joan take the fall for this quote unquote defeat. Love that for her. Anyway, so this truce that was to last 4 months began in September, but in December, we also find out that it has actually been extended to Easter of the next year. And during this truce, the royal court really has no need for Joan. I would have loved to be able to find some kind of information on where she was at this time. Like, was she staying at court? Was she, did she have a separate place that like she was living? Like, how she was feeling? But we just have no way of knowing. And we will absolutely be talking about all of this later, but we're incredibly lucky to have the records that we do have. So maybe I shouldn't be complaining, but if nothing else, it was probably nice for her to just get some kind of break because, if you'll remember, Joan has been actively in military campaigns for a solid 7 months. So I would say that she is entitled to a break, I think. So we now jump ahead a couple of months to March of 1430 to the town of Compiègne. This town was situated in an area of France that had recently been recaptured by the Armagnac forces. However, the town itself was under siege. So it was at this time that Joan set out with a company of volunteers to relieve the town. Now, it's important to know that Joan did not have like the express permission of Charles to do this because he was still observing the truce. It was not Easter yet. However, but here's the thing. Some scholars say that this was a desperate and treasonous act on Joan's part because she's going and attacking without the king's approval, right? But others point out that it couldn't possibly have been either of these things because there's actually no way that Joan could have launched an entire military campaign without the financial backing of the court. Like, it just couldn't have happened. So, what I think happened is this. I think that Charles couldn't officially say yes because of the truce, but he had to have been unofficially supportive of this. Otherwise, there's no way they could have done it. So, one thing that I love about this part of the story is that as Joan advanced with her army, their numbers grew larger and larger every day because other commanders were joining her with their forces. And this speaks loudly, okay? This speaks volumes about how the people in general still felt about her, even though faith in her had definitely begun to diminish within the higher ranks of the country. I think that we can say pretty confidently that the people, obviously the army included, still loved, supported, and believed in Joan very much. In fact, I don't think they ever stopped loving, supporting, and believing in Joan ever. So this army, this growing army, continued their advance, and they came to the town of Lagny-sur-Marne, and they defeated the Anglo-Burgundian force that was there, that was led by a mercenary. So during this little skirmish, this mercenary leader was captured by Joan's army. And normally, he would have been ransomed or exchanged, etc. But Joan allowed the townspeople to execute him after a trial. And I have thought about this a lot. And I actually debated about whether or not to include it in the episode because there's not a ton of information on it. It's interesting that this story, this point in Joan's life, this seems to be the first time that Joan is the actual military commander of what's going on here, not just some kind of figurehead who gives advice. I actually don't know if that was officially the case, mind you, but every source I have found seems to corroborate this conclusion. You could obviously look at this execution of this man in a lot of ways. You could look at it as good because she's winning things again and people are rallying around her. You could also say it's bad because the court is losing faith in her, so maybe Charles just didn't really care. I don't know. Either way, this section of the story I think is overall positive because I love us getting a glimpse of what life was like for Joan when she was in a formal position of military power. And when I first read this, I was very tempted to be like, whoa, Joan, like letting the power go to your head here. And I don't know if we can even make that judgment. I don't know if we can make any judgment, honestly, because I don't have the details on this trial. But whatever may be the case, I love getting to see Joan in a formal leadership position in this moment. I think that's very important. So, Joan and this combined army finally reached Compiègne on May 14th, 1430. After a few defensive forays against the Burgundian besiegers, she was very unfortunately forced to disband the majority of her army. And this is because the army had grown very large and it was becoming very difficult for the surrounding countryside to support so many troops. Because you may or may not know, that's how that works. When you're traveling with an army in medieval times, the surrounding countryside is where you get your food and supplies. So it just was, it wasn't able to support the army. So Joan had to say goodbye to everybody. So by the time Joan and her army were actually able to enter the city, there were only about 400 soldiers left with her, which is it's actually kind of sad, but she's there, she's going to help. All right, everybody. I told you at the top of the episode that we're doing things a little differently today. There's not going to be any buildup or reveal. I told you the bullet points of Joan's life. I hope that it has helped you kind of stay with me throughout this story. Nevertheless, I kind of feel like I've built up to a reveal, even though I haven't. I don't know. That wasn't the intention. I hope you don't feel that way, because that I I was trying to be open here. I hope you've been with me this whole time. So, as you know, the next part of Joan's story, it's not a secret to any of us who are here. Nevertheless, I find it quite excruciating, okay? However, it's crucial to Joan, to her story, and so we need to talk about it. And we'll get through it together. Just come with me on this, okay? Thank you. So let's fast forward a little bit, a couple of days. It's May 23rd, 1430. Joan accompanies a small force to attack a Burgundian camp northeast of town. This attack failed, and Joan of Arc was captured. She agreed to surrender to a pro-Burgundian nobleman named Lionel de Vendôme. That's definitely not how you say that, but I don't like him, so I don't care. He quickly took her away to his castle. Now, it's Joan, so she obviously attempted to escape. However, this was unsuccessful, and because of this attempt, she was moved to yet another castle, where, of course, she made another escape attempt. This one was pretty wild, though. She jumped out of a window into a dry moat. Not kidding. That happened. She did that. And she was injured, but she's obviously she survived. She was okay physically. How about that? So she was in the hands of the Burgundians for several months, but I have virtually no information on her time with them except for these few escape attempts. I wish I did, but I think it's safe to say that it probably wasn't a good time. Yeah, I'm going to put my stamp on that. It wasn't a good time. But obviously, okay, the English and the Burgundians are thrilled that they have Joan in their captivity or whatever. Custody, that's the word I was looking for. They're thrilled that they have Joan and that she's no longer a military threat to them. So the English negotiated with the Burgundians, again, their allies, to pay Joan's ransom so that they could take her into their custody. And a man, okay, so there's this dude, okay? I'm not going to call him a man because he isn't one. I hate him. Anyway, this person, okay, this dude by the name of Bishop Pierre Couchon played a very, very big role in negotiating Joan's ransom from the Burgundians, and these negotiations were completed in November. Now listen, everybody. We're gonna get to know this man very, very well. And I'm not going to hold back here, okay? I'm just not going to do it. This man, Bishop Pierre Couchon, he is, Okay, my notes say feel free to wildly insult him. So I'm going to do that. This man is the pond scum of hell. If hell has a pond and there is scum on it, he is that scum. If there is a fiery depths to the worst rest stop you've ever been in, that is his home. If 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 you've ever had the flu, it's because he was the bacteria that infected your body. If you have ever had a cosmic force work against you, it was probably this guy, okay? He is the most atrocious human being. He is horrible in every single way. If if you if you have ever had soda come out your nose and burn really badly, times that by like 100,000, it's this guy, okay? He is awful. He is awful. He is so awful and I hate him, okay? I hate him. Okay, let's move on from the insult section. So, even though this man was a very prominent bishop in the Catholic Church, he was also a partisan supporter of the Duke of Burgundy and the English crown. What do you know? So, again, he helped negotiate the terms of Joan's ransom, and after the English had paid it, they transferred her to the city of Rouen, which at the time was the English headquarters in France. It was basically the inner sanctum of English territory in Normandy. Oh, and I can hear you asking, so I'm going to answer your question. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that King Charles VII of France attempted to save Joan once she was captured, and especially not once she was transferred to the English. I'm going to say that again. There is absolutely no evidence that this king, who she helped become the king, attempted to save her even one time. And I'm going to tell you why I think that is. Now, I'm not an expert on this. This isn't my expertise, this particular moment in history, but I'm going to tell you what I think. Okay? I think that Charles was a little bit of a frightened little boy, first of all. Second of all, I think that Joan had done an incredibly good job of uniting his forces and having a lot of success. And so, honestly, at this point in her career and at this point in the saga of France's struggle with England, I think that the best thing that she could do for him and for the country at this point was be captured. The best thing that Joan could do for him was become a martyr. I truly believe that. And I think that that's why he never tried to save her. I feel pretty confident saying that. If you have evidence to the contrary, please let me know. But yeah, he didn't try to save her. And I think it's because he was like, okay, cool. Like, this will just fan the flames that we've got going. Great. I'm not going to save her. And guess what? He didn't. So let's talk about where we are right now, my friends. Joan has been captured. She has been transferred to the English. She has been taken to the inner sanctum of their territory, and nobody is coming to save her. And this is where we're going to end this episode. Yep, this is the end of this episode. I hope, if you're upset, that means I've done my job a little bit. So that's the end of this episode. As you can see, there's a lot in this story. There's a lot. The next episode will probably be about this long. There is a lot more to go over. Next episode, we will talk about Joan's trial. We'll get in depth into a lot of things. So stay tuned for that. This has been really fun, honestly. It's a very upsetting story. It is, but there's something very, very inspiring about it as well. And I hope that you were able to get some of that, at least in this episode. Joan is incredibly inspiring, and the things that she was able to do are just truly out of this world. Really, they really are. So, thank you for listening to part 1. This has been great. Again, part 2 will come out next week. And it's going to be probably pretty excruciating, honestly, but I'm excited. It will be okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for hanging out with me today, for being here with me in medieval France. We had a great time. You can follow me on the Instagram at notstrictlyhistory_podcast. You can shoot me a Gmail at notstrictlyhistory@gmail.com. If you would like to support the podcast, there is a listener support link in the description box that you can follow. And thank you guys. Thank you so much, as always, for being here and for diving into history with me. And I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful week. And we'll see you next time on Not Strictly History.